In this lecture, we'll talk about the non-strategic view of bargaining. The non-strategic view of bargaining focuses on the gains and the alternatives to reaching an agreement. The gains from agreement relative to the alternatives determine the terms of trade or the effective or ultimate bargaining outcome. One of the key questions to ask yourself at all times when engaged in a negotiating agreement, especially when looking through the lens of non-competitive or non-strategic bargaining, is can I find a way to increase my opponent's relative gain from reaching a bargain? In 1985, Texaco was found guilty by a Texas grand jury of interfering with an attempt by Pennzoil to acquire Getty Oil. The Texas jury found Texaco guilty and fined them $10.5 billion. Not a small sum of money, even for a large company like Texaco. Texaco appealed the verdict and was ultimately negotiating or entered into a lengthy negotiation process with Pennzoil to try to come to some agreement where Texaco's liability or ultimate settlement would be somewhere below that $10.5 billion. Now, 2 years into this negotiating process, in 1987, Texaco files for bankruptcy. This improved Texaco's bargaining position from several angles. For one, Pennzoil was unable to seize or go after any of Texaco's assets, so the $10.5 billion settlement all of a sudden became much more difficult for Pennzoil to conceivably collect upon. In addition, Texaco was freed up from the responsibility of paying interest and dividends on its stock, so that was another dimension on which or in which the bankruptcy improved Texaco's bargaining position. In 1988, Texaco and Pennzoil actually settled the case, with Texaco having to pay only $3 billion. Texaco successfully used the bankruptcy to reduce its liability by over 70%. In Texaco's case, the bankruptcy was used because it improved Texaco's relative bargaining position. This lecture talks about or discusses the idea of non-strategic bargaining, how strategies like the one used by Texaco can actually improve your bargaining position. The outcome in strategic bargaining games is dependent on the structure of the game, but in real life, the rules and structure of a bargaining process aren't always well defined and known in advance. John Nash saw this as a shortcoming of the strategic view of bargaining and proved actually that any reasonable outcome to a bargaining process would maximize the bargainer's surplus gains. The non-strategic view of bargaining is axiomatic or non-strategic. Axiomatic because it's based on some assumptions, and the key assumption is that bargainers will prefer an outcome that maximizes the overall gain or the overall surplus that accrues to both sides of the bargaining process. The gains from bargaining, therefore, are going to be measured relative to the alternatives, and those gains relative to the alternatives will determine the terms of trade. To increase your bargaining power in a non-strategic setting or from a non-strategic perspective, therefore requires you to either increase your opponent's gain from reaching an agreement or decrease your own gain. Let's look at the setup that John Nash used to show or prove this result. This formula here may be a little undaunting, but let's unpack it. It consists of three terms. Z is the agreement, or just the abstract way of representing what agreement is reached. We might think of that as the split of surplus. So if we're negotiating, is that split 50-50 or 75-25? What does that split look like, or what is that agreement? S of Z is the value of the agreement to each player. That might be 50-50 or 75-25, or it might be a more complicated formula. But S of Z is the gain from reaching an agreement. We're going to measure that relative to the disagreement value or the value of the next best alternative. So we can see here that we have two terms really, and each is enclosed in the square brackets. The first, S1 of Z minus D1, measures player one's gains from reaching an agreement relative to what their status or state will be if they don't reach an agreement. And the second term in square brackets, S2Z minus D2, also measures the gains from reaching an agreement, but this time for player 2 relative to player 2's next best outside opportunity. To make this kind of simple, or take a simple example, let's suppose two brothers are bargaining over a dollar bill. If no agreement is reached, neither participant gains. But if they reach an agreement, the older brother has a surplus of Z. Let's let the younger brother's surplus be 1 minus Z, where Z is the percentage of the dollar that they're going to split. Nash would say that the optimal agreement, or the agreement that provides the most benefit to each brother, is one in which they split the gains. In other words, 1/2 is the axiomatic solution, split evenly. Now, if we think about this, and you could try this on your own, take 1/2 times 1/2, that equals 1/4, or 0.25. I would challenge you to find any other two numbers between 0 and 1 where they add up to 1, like 25% and 75%, or 1/3 and 2/3, and multiply those together and find a product, or find two ways to split that dollar where the product is greater than 0.25 or 1/4, which is what we've got here. You won't find it. That's why in this simple example, the 1/2 split is the axiomatic or optimal solution. Now, suppose that the older brother, having been around the block a few times, knows that if he finds a way to share that dollar bill with his brother, his parents are going to reward him for being such a good older brother and actually give him a bonus. See, you shared 50-50, we'll give you 50 cents more to make that up from you. So the total gain here, or the total pot, goes from $1 to $1.50. Now, if the younger brother is smart, and most younger brothers are, he'll know that. And so actually the Nash non-strategic optimal bargaining outcome would be for the brothers not only to split the original dollar, but to split the gains. Maybe the older brother tells the younger brother, look, if mom and dad give me an extra 50 cents, I'll split that with you too. Just agree to split this. And in that way, actually makes the younger brother more eager to reach an agreement. So agreeing to share or split a bonus, should it materialize, actually incentivizes the younger brother to reach an agreement. In fact, agreement bonuses are used at many companies because these sales bonuses actually encourage salespeople to accept weaker agreements. Salespeople accepting or receiving a bonus will have an incentive to accept a weaker agreement because that will actually lead them to a better outcome when we incorporate the effect of the bonus or measure the effect of the bonus in that outcome. So sales bonuses lead to lower outcomes and oftentimes lower prices in the negotiating process. When you increase your opponent's gain in an agreement, you make him more willing to agree. Or if you reduce your own gain, it makes you less willing and actually improves your bargaining position. So Nash's non-strategic view, when we contrast that with the strategic view of bargaining, the strategic view emphasizes the timing of who moves first and the ability to make a credible commitment, which we can think about a classic negotiating strategy between a labor union and management as being a good example or context in which the strategic view can be analyzed. The non-strategic view of bargaining really emphasizes or incorporates the idea of decreasing your own gain from trade. In other words, a simple example would be when do I want to ask for a raise? Well, the best time to ask for a raise and actually be likely to get it is when you have another job offer. If you don't get the raise, you've got another job offer with a high salary, your gain from getting the raise is actually reduced because you've improved your outside option. Doing so improves your bargaining position. Let's take an example of a managed care organization. Managed care organizations are very prevalent in the healthcare and pharmaceutical benefits industry. And let's suppose that it has a network. And just to make this very simple, let's suppose that in a particular city there are 2 independent hospitals. The network or the managed care organization really finds it absolutely essential to have at least one hospital in its network. If it goes into a city and it has neither hospital in its network, you can imagine that it's not going to be a very attractive benefits package or network to not have either of the local hospitals. So having at least one hospital in the network is essential. And let's suppose that that's worth, say, $100 million to this managed care organization. Now, if it could get the second hospital on board also and have both hospitals in its network, that would add some value, although not double the value. So let's assume that if both hospitals are in the network, that increases the value to $120 million. Okay. And there's no value without at least one hospital in the network. Now, the gain to the managed care organization of adding either hospital when it has the first is only $20 million. The incremental value of going from 1 to 2 hospitals is $20 million. The managed care organization can effectively use this to its great advantage. It can go or separate the 2 hospitals and with each one negotiate as if it has the other one already in the network. In other words, going to hospital 2, the managed care organization can drive a hard bargain. Say, look, we're negotiating with hospital 1, assuming we get that, adding you to our network will be worth an additional $20 million, 100 to 120. The Nash non-strategic view would suggest that those gains or that surplus would be split 50-50, 10 million to the second hospital, and in that limited bargaining situation, 10 to the managed care organization. But the key idea there is the second hospital has very little bargaining power. They get $10 million. Then let's turn it around. The managed care organization goes to hospital number 1, says, look, assuming we got hospital number 2 in our network, adding you is going to be worth $20 million. 10 million split, 10 million goes to the hospital 1. If they successfully bring both hospitals into the network, each hospital gains 10 million. The managed care organization reaps the lion's share of this pie. If the total pie is $120 million and 10 plus 10 or 20 go to the hospitals, the managed care organization gets $100 million. So the split with each individual hospital would be $10 million for joining the managed care organization. However, the hospitals can dramatically improve their bargaining position by merging. What happens if they merge? Well, now it's an all or none deal. The managed care organization no longer has the option of dropping just one hospital or the other. It's both or neither. In this case, the gains will be evenly split. The options are either neither hospital, which is worth 0, or both hospitals worth $120 million. If those gains are evenly split, they go $60 million to the managed care organization, $60 million to the merged hospital group, which, assuming an equal merger, goes 30-30 to each hospital. The merged hospitals then together receive 60, on a standalone basis each receive 30, and that improves their outcome dramatically relative to the 10 million and 10 million that they would receive in the Nash non-strategic bargaining outcome if they negotiated on a standalone basis. And we see actually in practice that mergers are often a tool used precisely for this benefit. Mergers and strategic alliances improve the bargaining position of the firms that enter into that alliance or that merge together. Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Nash non-strategic bargaining perspective.